I'll tell you, the most important thing about me is I am a person in long-term recovery, which means I haven't used drugs or alcohol for 21 years. The Grateful Life Center is modeled on a program called The Healing Place in Louisville, Kentucky. I crawled into the Healing Place in 1993, and I'm the original peer mentor because I was done with the program. They didn't know what to do with me, and I didn't have any place to go. So I still don't know. So I started working there. And the other one that we shared, Carly and I shared earlier, my voice tends to be a little gravelly at times. You heard me mention earlier that I was a former newscaster. I am just now a year and a half on the other side of throat cancer treatment. And it was successful. I caught it very early. Stage 1, I didn't even have to have chemo. I caught it so early. But now, you'll all appreciate this living in the Ohio Valley. There's no nice way to describe it except to say, while they took care of the throat cancer part, I had one little thing on my vocal cords. They also had to do a bunch of work up in there, in the sinuses. So when they were done, the doctor said, everything looks great. We got that all cleaned out. It all looks good. He said, the only thing I can tell you that might be negative is that your susceptibility to allergies is going to increase about tenfold. In the Ohio Valley? That's a killer. So if you hear me grumbling and my throat sounds raspy, don't try and clear my throat for me. I hear people go, It's not a hairball. I feel totally fine. It doesn't hurt. There's no pain. I just like when you got to clear your throat, when you got a cold or something. It just kind of gets that way. It gets grumbly at times. So what we're going to attempt to do in an entire hour, talk about two things. I'm sorry the legislators didn't get a chance to stay because this is what I want you to think about as we go through this tonight. I want you to think about this is how you need to start talking to them and how you need to educate them a little bit. But we're going to talk about the language of addiction and the language of recovery. And they are totally two different things. And it's something we've got to learn. I'll tell you very briefly how I got involved in all this before PAR. I worked in Lexington in television there. Then I moved to Louisville to go to the Healing Place. I was sober about 5 years. And I was a former board member of the Better Business Bureau in Lexington. They were having some kind of business reunion, and the president of that board knew what I had been through. 5 years sober, all right, 5 years sober. He called me and said, we'd like you to come because we're honoring the past presidents. And we'd like you to come, and we know the struggle you've had, and where we're going to have our business meeting, and where you have to park, there are 2 bars in between. So we've assigned 2 people to escort you from the parking lot to the meeting. What? And I'm thinking, what? Why? Why is he? What is this whole process? It's about the same time. I was news people. I was one of the first news. Well, I got to kind of go backwards. I was one of the first news people to become the news story. The first person before the news story was Susan Rook from CNN. And Susan and I knew each other, and we made the joke. And we started talking about this. So here's the reason they had that attitude. They didn't know how to treat me. And the reason they didn't know how to treat me is because by my silence, I was letting them define me. I was still part of a 12-step program, hiding in the smoky church basements. And like Patrick Kennedy says, he didn't have a choice on being anonymous. I didn't either. What I did was I didn't show up to do the 11 o'clock news. I did the 5:30 newscast. I didn't show up to do the 11 o'clock newscast. Without telling anybody, I took a trip to Florida. So all the networks were covering it. CNN, ABC, they were all there. So I was one of the first to do the missing anchorman, big story. When they found out there was no story, the story died. Because I just ran away from home is what I did. And so I got interested in this whole idea of language. And also being a reporter, I questioned things. And one of the things I questioned when I first got to the healing place, I had been through a couple of treatment centers before I got there. And it didn't register. But when I first got to the healing place, and it was a little bit more serious, and they started talking about 12-step programs being self-help programs. And I said, well, wait a minute. If I'm in a group, how can it be self-help? It's got to be group help. So it can't be a self-help program. So naturally, I had to question everything. That questioning cost me a few more problems and another couple of years. So that's how I got involved in the whole language thing and started thinking about it a little bit more. And Charlotte and I have had some good discussions about this over the years as well. But let me tell you about PAR, People Advocating Recovery. And before you all leave, as you go out, there are 3 things there. Get one of each. That's everything that's in here that we're going to talk about. My contact information is in there as well. But our PAR, People Advocating Recovery, our mission and vision. Our mission, People Advocating Recovery, is a statewide group of concerned individuals working to eliminate barriers to recovery from addiction. Our vision, a Kentucky free of stigma and barriers to recovery. And that's changed since you've been on the board. We shortened it. A Kentucky free of stigma and barriers to recovery. The stigma, what people think of us, what people think of me. I couldn't go to a business meeting without having escorts from the parking lot to the meeting because I had to walk by 2 bars. They were afraid what I do. And our language is so important. It's the key to changing the way people with substance use disorders and people with mental illness see themselves as well as how they're seen by others. Changing language is a way to personally and culturally close one chapter in our history and open another. Don Coyas from White Bison, Native American Recovery. Love this. I love this quote from him. Words are important. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. There are many people across the world that think a dandelion is a flower. And there are other people who spend billions of dollars with chemicals killing the dandelion because it's a weed. I grew up in St. Louis. My next door neighbors were first-generation Germans. He grew dandelions in his backyard because every Christmas he gave us a bottle of dandelion wine. For him, that was a treasure. Was for me too. But anyway, we talked earlier, you asked the question about the world changing so fast. We are totally bombarded right now with information. I'm a computer junkie. I've owned network companies and done the things like that and built computers and was doing computers. Jason does. When I still had a 1400 baud modem where you stuck the cradle of a phone in a suction cups and that was your connection to the internet back then. It's not that long ago either. So anyway, we are constantly bombarded. And we hear, and I'll pick on them, since I wrote these stories and I'm one of the guilty parties. News media is a killer. It covers every negative thing that we do. That's news. That's what it does. Seldom do you hear this from our news media friends. Right now there are 23 million Americans who self-profess to being in recovery. 23 million say they are in recovery. The number is probably significantly higher because we know that there are a whole lot of people who probably could be qualified clinically as an alcoholic or an addict, who quit using drugs or alcohol, never went through any type of recovery program, now don't use or abuse, but they don't call themselves in recovery. They just don't identify with. So 23 million Americans identify as being in recovery. I want you all to think about this as you do your work, because it's really important, especially when we're around each other. What's the percentage of time you spend telling your story of addiction versus your story of recovery? There is a place and a time. Behind that podium in a 12-step meeting is where you share the addiction or the alcoholism. When I'm with the general public, I don't want to be telling them the things that I did because of the picture that it paints. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I love Calvin and Hobbes. I don't know if you all know that the author, Gary Watterson, excuse me, is in recovery. And so Calvin is just, if you don't know Calvin and Hobbes, it's part of my daily ritual. Here's a good one. I don't know how this started, but I have a daily ritual on how I start my day and how I end my day. Talk about total opposites. I start my morning off, I read Calvin and Hobbes every single morning on the internet. I used to do it in the newspaper. This is probably, some of these are 30 and 40 years old. I read Calvin and Hobbes every morning. I go to bed every night, I either listen or read a Sherlock Holmes story. Don't have a clue. But anyway, here's Calvin's that ornery little kid that mom and dad have to put up with. Like I said, the author is in recovery. If you know that, you'll start identifying with what he says and what happens. So here's Calvin, his mom's in the chair, couch, reading the newspaper, relaxing. Calvin says, I'm hungry, can I have a snack? Mom says, sure, help yourself. As Calvin's running away out of the kitchen with the cookie jar and a cookie in his mouth, Mom hollers out, well, you can have an apple or an orange from the fridge. And Calvin says, you know, even though we're both talking English, we're not speaking the same language. I rest my case. Our stories, as Anthony told, our stories have power. And there is a place for our stories. But there's a way to tell our story so that we understand that power. Policymakers, allies, friends, neighbors, employers. What we want them to know, as Anthony did in a very short, excellent job in a short period of time, told you what his problem was, but he also told you he got well. Too frequently, people don't get to the well part. They're too busy telling their war story and too busy trying to qualify themselves as I'm the worst that's ever been. Nobody's ever been as bad as me or done as many bad things as I've ever done. And they just forget to tell you, you know what, I got well. And so that's really important. So I call it our war stories. If belong to a 12-step program, I'm behind the podium and I'm sharing that story, that's when I tell you those things. When I'm testifying in front of the legislators, I'm not going to tell them the things that I did. I don't need to. Because if I do, we'll get to it in a second. If I do, it's not going to help our cause. Charlotte mentioned earlier, there's a national organization, advocacy organization called Faces and Voices of Recovery. I was a founding board member, stayed on the board for a while, rotated off, went back, became the president. Because of this, I had to step down after a while. And the national organization, AMPAR, People Advocating Recovery, we believe in any pathway to recovery. What's important is how you is getting there, not how, but that you get there. Now, we frequently try to avoid, as an organization, PAR, we frequently try to avoid some of the issues which tend to be a little bit controversial, for which there is no definitive answer, is the best way to say it. We don't go in front of the legislators and try to argue that addiction is a disease. We don't. We leave that to Dr. Nora Volkoff and other experts and doctors who can say it. I can't explain exactly how it does, and I do a workshop on it, the science of addiction and recovery, and I still can't get it all out and tell you. I got to read some of it. I can't tell you exactly in medical terms, but I can feel it. I know what it feels like, but that doesn't work. So we kind of stay away from some of those issues. medication-assisted treatment, although we're not quite that far away from doing that anymore. We're, our early board that was it's 12 years now. 12 years ago, that was verboten. We didn't even talk about that. Now it's kind of switched over a little bit. Now it's not so bad. So any pathway to recovery, it's important that you get there. I frequently talk about the message that we want to deliver. So the question is, what's a message? It's the most important information that you want your audience to hear. The most important thing. You may have noticed and you may not have, but maybe you did. When I introduced myself, I said I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means I haven't used drugs or alcohol for 21 years. I defined myself instead of letting you define me. In my message, if I say to the general public, not in the 12-step meeting, to the general public, if I say, hi, I'm Micah, I'm an alcoholic and an addict, people start hiding their purses, watching where their TV is. They have no idea what 21 years. So I reframe that into a different message, saying the same exact thing. Why is the message important? I sort of told you, but here's my favorite one. When you don't know what you're talking about, it's hard to know when you're finished. Some of you may remember Tommy Smothers from the Smothers Brothers. So let me reframe that a little bit. You've all been to classes where the class is over at 9 o'clock. At 2 minutes to 9, the instructor says, okay, let me wrap it up. 5 after 9? Well, one more thing. 9:15. Well, before you all leave, and they're still going, and it's still going, and still going. That sort of fits this. Instead of saying, when you don't know what you're talking about, use this phrase. When you don't know what you want to say, you frequently don't know when you're finished. Another great quote, now I can't remember who it's from, I just drew a blank. It's recent. Too many good pieces of music finish way too long after the last note. Think on it a little bit. All right, so you got to know what you want to say. So when we're talking to the legislators, what we want to say is very important. The celebrity addiction is a killer. We have to put up with that. We have to fight it. And it's probably not going to change. It's going to continue. Lindsay Lohan has been in the news since she's a baby. And she's still in the news doing stuff. Ted Williams, anybody, not the baseball player, 5, 6 years ago now, I've lost track. Ted Williams was the homeless man that was found on the streets of Columbus, Ohio. News crew was just doing interviews with the homeless, stuck a microphone in front of his face, and out came this most magnificent, beautiful radio voice. He's a homeless man. So they kind of followed him, found out, with drugs and alcohol, the whole bit. Well, since I'm, since I'm doing things nationally, people with the New York Times called me, knowing that I'm a former media guy, and here's what they wanted me to do, and I'll make this really short. They wanted me basically to do an assessment on his chances for recovery. I'm not a clinician. I have never met the man. I've only read the story and seen the story. But they wanted me to do an assessment on what I think his chances of recovery are. I didn't do it. But see, that's the other part that we have to watch out for. There are some people who would there are probably some people who would give their opinion and diagnose him and go through the whole bit with no qualifications, never met him, no nothing. So those are the kind of things that we have to fight as well. And this is one that really bothered me. When Philip Seymour Hoffman died recently, when he overdosed, the description in the newspaper was, and the media, he was found half naked on the bathroom floor with a needle hanging out of his arm. That's how they described this talented man's death. So I ask you, if he had a heart attack, would they say he was found half naked on the bathroom floor with a Big Mac in his hand and French fries scattered across the floor? Why the sensationalism? It sells. So we have to be careful. This is where I got ahead of myself a little bit. We have to be careful on the words that we use. When we start using the wrong words, here are the kind of pictures we paint. When we talk about a drunk, addict, dope fiend, these are the pictures that we're painting for the general public. I dislike, it's personal, I dislike very much when I'm in a 12-step meeting. I really dislike when I hear somebody say, I'm just a drunk, a thief, a liar. Then why are you here? That's what you were. You're not today. Hopefully, you changed your life around. So these are old things that have hung around for a long time. So we paint these pictures that are just absolutely wrong. Not only do we paint them about ourselves, think of the parents who have a child who they know is actively using. And I say that. Or think of the poor young kid, and I mean this nicely, just young person who is currently using and really wants to get help. But we talk like this in front of him. What we're doing is taking away the hope that we're going to give somebody. So we want to be able to give them hope. We want them to know that there's hope, there's help, there's healing. All these things are around, but when I'm using these negative terms, it's totally wrong. And this one I know Charlotte will love on these. I've been collecting these, and you'll all probably give me more, and that's fine. Bring them on. Some phrases that we need to ban. My drug of choice. What does that say? When I tell somebody, well, my drug of choice was, it feeds into that media bit about, well, I knew it was a choice all along. You don't have a disease. This is not a medical, this is your choice. Out the door. They have to want to change. I will guarantee you, I know lots of people who had no desire whatsoever to change when they got into recovery. They have to hit rock bottom. This is a phrase that is used in the rooms. To me, rock bottom is death. That's rock bottom. I have a personal rock bottom, but when we use that generically, it's not a good description. Charlotte and I have had this discussion, I don't know, 10 years or more. And I've gracefully tried to explain to her that when we're doing this, it's two different understandings. Those of us who are in recovery, in the room, and we use that phrase with each other, we understand what it means, rock bottom. Doesn't mean, because there's a phrase in that book that floats around, that no matter how far down the scale you've gone. So anyway, we'll throw it out. It's gone. All right? These are old cliches from the early days of alcoholism. Drunk, addict, dope fiend, dirty urine screen. Another one I hate. My wife's a counselor, and I got her to stop using it. And she's driving them nuts using it. Nice, positive and negatives. And they go, see, what's positive, what's negative? And you can't figure it out. We have news stories that talk of fighting demons, and that life is a daily struggle against the demons. It's been a long time since I've struggled against the demon of alcoholism. I'll be 21 years next month. So it was probably almost 20 years ago that I quit struggling against the demons. There's, to me, again, some of these are personal, Sorry, I just popped your microphone there. Some of these are personal. I have problems in life, but I don't have problems with alcohol because I don't use alcohol to solve the problems in my life. And so there are no demons of this kind that I'm fighting against. I think when I use that phrase, I'll keep going back to Anthony here since he was here speaking and I could out him. I don't think he's daily fighting demons. He probably might think of using some drugs, but that's not fighting a demon at this point. So what I'm saying is not a daily, all-day thing that I do from wake up to bedtime.
I think, Mike, the one that you did talk about was some of them just have to die. You know, that was one that you skipped over that one.
Oh, okay. I thought I was on there.
Mention it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them just have to die so that others can live. No, they don't. Absolutely not.
We would never say that about someone who had any other disease. That some people, like for example, cancer that we've been talking about tonight, some of them just have to die so other people can live.
Yeah.
We would be, hung up on a flagpole or something if we did something like that.
That's right.
I knew it was on there. Thanks. I haven't. All right. You know, we have been incorporating mental illness into substance use disorder. Another one of those words that we've quit using, and I did a long time ago, is substance abuse, even though the state agencies still use it. And the reason I'm glad that we're getting rid of it and using substance use disorder, because I can tell you I never abused alcohol. I treated it with tender, loving care. I put it to bed and put it in a pillow and covered it up at night. My Chivas Regal got more care than my ex-wife did. But the same way, the phrases we should ban. This one I started working on with Patty McCarthy when I was in Vermont. We did a whole day trying, and I'm waiting for some of the reports back. But here's the phrase. Think it through, because I'm still working on it too a little bit. The mentally ill is used all the time in our headlines. The mentally ill. But we say, what about using the phrase equal coverage for the women? Sounds a little weird, doesn't it? New era for the gays. So what we're doing here is we're creating a whole group of people. So what do we do instead? Person's not defined by diagnosis. If you have a mental illness, it doesn't define you any more than your heart disease defines you if you're a cardiac patient. That's not your identification. A person is a person who happens to have depression or schizophrenia. So the correct term is people with mental illness, people living with mental illness, people being treated for mental illness, not the mentally ill. We don't say the alcoholic, the drug addict, unless we're trying to demean them. And we're trying to put down a whole class of people, or a whole neighborhood. That's where the drug addicts hang out. Now you can also paint an incorrect picture. I haven't told this one for a long time, and this is for Charlotte. She'll like this one, I know. You'll understand why.
Okay.
My wife is a retired school teacher. One of her pet, and she's in recovery. She's even helped me do these trainings across the country. One similar to this. And one of her pet peeves, one night when we were sitting with a bunch of people having dinner, Donna came up with this, and she said, you know, people paint incorrect pictures of teachers all the time. She said, you know, I get this stuff when people, and we'll call it the elevator speech. You know, you get in the elevator, people say, oh, what do you do? And then Donna would say, I'm a school teacher, very proudly. And they'd say, oh man, I wish I had a job like that, where I only had to go to work at 9 o'clock, got off at 2:30 in the afternoon, got 3 months off during the summer. Man, that would be great. And boy, she'd hit the ceiling. So we took this same thing and changed it, using this language, telling the same story. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a teacher in the inner city. I work with behavioral disorder children. I get to work about 7, and I get to leave the building about 6, and then I have to go home and make phone calls, get done about 8 or 9. Then maybe I can get some dinner in before I have to get ready for the next day. This year they want me to take 3 more workshops, professional development days, and so I might not even get 2 weeks of vacation. And to top it off, they want to lower my salary. Oh, oh, really? Same job.
I have to jump in here and tell you my stories about my elevator speech when I was a teacher. You know, you go to the cocktail parties, the general conversation always starts somehow with, oh, what do you do for a living? And I would say, I'm a school teacher.
Ooh, baby.
And yet, they would always be positive and pleasant and say, well, where do you teach? And I would say, at Hughes High School, which is an inner city school over in Clifton, right across from UC. And then their expression would be more. Because then, you know, it was implied that, you know, I work with inner city kids and, you know, I do all that stuff. And that's what caused the
Yeah.
expression to hit the floor.
So with our language, that's what we do. We tell a different story. Just like I used my wife's example. Instead of what are you, what do you do? And that's where, we're frequently asked that. People don't ask you, what are you? They ask, what do you do? Now, those of you in here, I think will understand this. One of the worst ones I've ever heard in my entire life for our field, so to speak, is doing this at Kentucky school 3 or 4 years ago. What I always do is I have everybody in the room go around and introduce themselves, and who are you representing, and sort of what is your profession. And I had one guy, I think he was from Northern Kentucky. I think he was from Transitions. It's been a while. And he was. I can see him, but I can't remember his name. But he said, as we went around the room, he said, oh, I'm just a detox monitor. And I about hit the ceiling. For any of you who have ever worked in a detox unit, it's one of the toughest jobs in the world. It is so hard. And so that one was, to me, was like 10 fingernails on a blackboard. So we helped him devise his own. I'm not going to write it for you. Devise your own, what's comfortable with. And he came up with, and I'll paraphrase, but I'm close enough. He came up with, oh, I'm the first person somebody sees when they walk through the door and are about to turn their life around. Same thing, exactly. But boy, does that make a difference. Because I have noticed, and this is not a negative or a put down, I have noticed as I've traveled the country that people who work in the field, nurses, social workers, have the most difficult time telling people what they do for a living. And the reason that is because you are around it daily, 24/7. And just like people in recovery, you understand the language, the nuances of what they are. If somebody, if I'm talking with somebody who's in recovery and I say things like, they say, how you doing? Man, I'm doing all right, just one day at a time. Here's what the general public hears. I have a problem with alcohol, and I can only stay sober one day at a time. For the next 3 or 4 days or 3 or 4 weeks, I'm a raving alcoholic out causing trouble. And I can only do this one day at a time. So we tend to use our own jargon. And that's some of the things that we have to change. My best example of this is my wife and I have been in the same house about 15 years now. When we first moved there, we introduced ourselves to our next door neighbors. And without thinking, I told him where I worked at the Healing Place in Louisville. And he went, isn't that a homeless place for drunks? And I went, yeah. He didn't talk to me for a year. Never spoke to me. And you know what happens? Eventually, that place you talked about for the people who have a problem, so I've got a brother that could use some help. Happens every time. Brother, nephew, somebody. So by this time, I had learned to change the language. And I changed the language on him. And now it's totally different. Now we don't share donuts and cookouts together because our houses are a couple acres apart, but the attitude is totally different now. And he and his wife are always, asking if there's anything they can do, how they can help. So I tell them to take down donations, do stuff like that. So anyway, that's the language. That's the difference. Like I said, this is almost, you got a day and a half in 30 minutes. Woo-hoo! How about that? But I think you get the concept of what we need to do. Among ourselves, we need to change our language. You've already identified yourself as a 12-stepper, so I'm not outing you here. We have a place for that. We have a place to use that language. That's where we use that language. But when we're talking to the general public, people we don't know, the news media, the legislators, we don't use that language. And I didn't think to bring this one, but there was when I helped develop this messaging with Faces and Voices 10 years ago now. There was a lot of pushback from a lot of the old timers about we were breaking traditions, violating the traditions of AA, I can say it here. But then when we explained to them that, what about people who don't get sober in AA? And they start talking about their recovery. Well, they can't be violating your tradition if they're not a member, can they? And so we actually got, for the first time ever, the central office, World Services Organization, actually sort of got involved in an outside issue. And they sent us a letter praising what we were doing and say, go for it. And yesterday I was shocked. It's been a while, but I was really shocked as I was driving and heard a commercial on radio for 12-step meeting, for an AA meeting. Not for Al-Anon, but for the actual meeting. And it gave the address. Oh, well, hell, so much for that anonymity. I don't feel bad now. So changing the language is what we want to do. Now we're going to switch gears just a little bit, but you'll see that it's all related. Because you've been talking about advocacy, and here's what's important about advocacy. When people go to see their legislators, or they have an issue, it goes back to what Tommy Smothers said. They usually don't have a plan of action. They go in flying blind. They go in with enthusiasm, and that's great. There's nothing more enthusiastic than a parent who has lost a child. But you have to have a plan of action, and if you don't, sometimes it doesn't work. So we didn't quite talk about advocacy versus lobbying. They're very similar, but then let's just separate them this way. So we know the number one job of an advocate is to educate policymakers and the public. As someone invested in the health of your community, you have information that those policymakers needed. They said it. You guys have the stuff we need to know. We can't know everything. They're part-time legislators. Full-time legislators don't have the time to know every issue. The best advocates are not full-time paid lobbyists, but rather individuals who share their experience with policymakers and their staff. The words are almost gotten to the point where an advocate and a lobbyist are interchangeable. Charlotte and I are both lobbyists, as well as, are you still a lobbyist? Okay. I should have asked for it, said you were. Charlotte and I are both lobbyists, which means we have to keep some records if we buy a legislator a cup of coffee. True, I'm serious. But it's a myth, that's what I'm trying to get to. It's a myth on how much money a nonprofit organization can spend on actual lobbying. Most people think it's just a little bit. It's actually a huge amount that you can spend on lobbying. But they're so interchangeable. I describe myself as an advocate lobbyist. I'm both, since I do both. I like to talk about it this way for my own benefit And when somebody really needs a good explanation, advocate is a person who is asking for a position, an idea, has something of this. The lobbyist, usually, I'm not a lawyer, didn't even play one on TV. I am staying at the Holiday Inn though. A lobbyist is a person normally asking for a particular vote for a party or a candidate. Not asking for a candidate to vote a certain way. That come out okay? I'm not gonna, if I'm a lobbyist, I'll ask you to vote for this candidate or I'll ask you to vote for this party. But as an advocate, I can go in and ask the legislator, would you please vote this way? Clear enough? Sometimes I have a hard time getting through that because they're so close. But anyway, before engaging in public policy, be sure to assess whether your planned activities are lobbying or simple advocacy, and if it's lobbying, how much your organization can do without exceeding the IRS limits. It's big. Nonprofit organizations often unnecessarily limit their ability to get involved in public policy out of fear of losing their tax-exempt status. But the good news is you can. You can spend a lot. Now, being an active advocate. Write your policymakers, one way. Not everybody can get up and speak before a legislator. Some people have a fear of doing the one-on-one. Some people have a fear of speaking in front of groups. So there are other ways you can be an active advocate. You can write your policymakers. Make a personal visit if you know them, like they told you. Call them. Present testimony or speak at town hall and public meetings. A couple of good ways you can do it. It's all about building your network, and it's about building relationships. It's not always about who you know, but it is about working both sides of the aisle. If you're going to be an effective advocate, personal opinion, if you're going to be an effective advocate, you need to refrain from criticizing your opposing party. All right? Don't call them names. We got enough of that going on in politics right now. I did my first political campaign. I'm 67 years old. I did my first political campaign 60 years ago. I was 7 years old. My grandmother was a precinct worker. I was in St. Louis, Missouri, and the man running for mayor, his name was Alfonso Cervantes. That's all I'm going to say. I had to go door to door, and kids could still walk around the neighborhoods back then. I had to go door to door handing out sample ballots. Little did I know it was not legal to be crossing his opponent's name out. And that's what he had me doing. Took a big black crayon and marked his opponent's name out and handed out sample ballots. So anyway, that's sidetracked. But no both sides of the aisle. Developing a partnership. Who else is working on this issue? Other agencies. One of the main issues that PAR started on a long time ago was the restoration of voter rights in the state of Kentucky. In simple terms, once you have a felony conviction, you lose your right to vote for life unless you get a partial pardon from the governor. We started realizing there were a whole lot of different people working on this same campaign. We all had the same goal, but not for the same reason. So we formed a coalition. It eventually ended up with, 122 some different groups, including some of them like the Quakers, the AFL-CIO, just groups that you wouldn't think, that would, like recovery, groups that you wouldn't think together. Stephanie spoke at one of our rallies. Was it last year?
Not this year, but the year before.
Damn, I'm really getting confused. All right, and Charlotte's always been there, so it doesn't count. Charlotte and I have been there from the get-go. So it's really good to work with other organizations. I'm so happy to see a new group, a new organization that is formed, although I don't like their name very much, again, personal preference, there's a new group formed called Young People in Recovery. That's the actual name. I wish they had picked something different because it's kind of hard to describe. But a lot of them are students. And so it's really, it's really good. And so I was just recently working on a merger with Faces and Voices of Recovery and Young People in Recovery. Fell apart, just didn't come out. I quit. That's what happened. All right, so successful advocacy is a planned effort. It's focused, it's organized, it's fact-based. One of the legislators said it, don't lie to me. It's active, and it's future-oriented. We forget frequently that we should never be done. Once something starts going, we should keep it going. And by keeping it going, let's just take the voter rights thing. All right, suppose we get the bill passed, rights got restored. What would be next? Informing people that their rights have been restored. There are so many people that wouldn't have a clue. So let's think about this. Here are the steps that you take to organize your advocacy campaign. Changing your world begins with knowing what needs to change and why. This old expression of think outside the box. Well, I don't like the expression think outside the box because too many people don't know what's in the box to begin with. And they start arguing about something, but they don't even know what they're arguing about yet. So you got to know what it is. You have to define it. Develop your story. A strong, compelling personal story makes an issue come alive and stays with the policymaker long after you've left the room or long after your letter is read. Casey's Law is the best example we've ever had. Charlotte went in there and shared the story. One session, bam, there we go. Naloxone, same way. It's those stories that work, the personal stories. But again, you gotta watch how you tell that story. Define your request. Decide exactly what you want the policymaker to do. And so this will guide every action you take. Too infrequently, people will go into a legislator and say, here's the problem. And they're done. And when they walk out, the legislator's sitting there going, well, I wonder what they want me to do about it. Got to have a plan of action. Get the facts. Information is power. Find facts that support your request. And remember, when you're talking to the legislators, remember, not sometimes, always, you've got to separate fact from opinion because all opinions aren't going to be the same. Find partners. You get more done, get your message to more people if you work with other people who really share your dream. Getting to the right person. Boy, is that ever important. We had the same thing up here discussed again when the legislators were talking about. Somebody comes from Louisville to northern Kentucky and says, man, I voted for you every year. I don't know you. So make sure that you're talking to the right person. And I have, I have a personal experience with that. I have now been off of television almost 22 years. And I was on television in Lexington. And I had hair back then, too. But I can't tell you how often when I'm in that town that people will come up to me and say, oh, Mike, love you guys, you're great. I watch you every single night. I've been gone 22 years and they're watching me every night. They're either lying or they're not paying any attention to who they're watching. Or we all look alike. We all had helmet hair. It kind of doesn't blow in the hurricane. The top of mine blew off. But anyway, make sure you're talking to the right person. You're not wasting their time, not wasting your time. Choose your tactics. There are dozens of ways to get your message across. Decide how you want to communicate before you start taking action. That is really important. Because you can go in there blind. But I'm having to rethink this one because Jason and I were in D.C. 2 or 3 weeks ago with the Harm Reduction Coalition, the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And I have a friend who is there, I forgot what she does, I don't know, but she's coordinator. But she brought a bunch of us together. And of course, from Kentucky, it was me from the organization, plus I've known her for about 10 years or so and helped her here in Kentucky. Jason working with naloxone. And then we had somebody two from California. Where were they? I've lost track now.
California and, yeah.
Okay.
Two from California.
Okay, so there were 7 of us who went together. Rob Morrissey, who's the head of, I always forget it. Rob Morrissey is the head of the single state providers. There's an organization, the head of substance use disorganization. Oh boy, is that ever Freudian? The substance use divisions in state organizations have their chairperson, or whatever you want to call them, director. That each state belongs to a group, a board. And I just can't, NAAs, it's NCAAs, Ds, whatever. None of those acronyms. And anyway, he joined us. So what I'm trying to say is there were 3 of us that knew each other, a couple that knew each other, but we had never been together before. We actually went into McConnell's office, Rand Paul's office, Massey, Hal Rogers, and one legislator from California, and one from Indiana, mine. But we went in there totally unprepared. Never worked together. We knocked them dead. It was one of those things that just happened to work right. Nobody stepped over each other. But after I thought about it, it's because we'd all been doing it before. And the woman we were working with from California was a legislative aide at one time. And she's also in recovery, but it wasn't until a couple of months ago she started letting people know she actually was in recovery. So there's a lot of changes. That was a fun time. Create a detailed plan. Make sure that you're communicating the right message to the right people at the right way at the right time. It's so simple, but it's some things that we just don't do. A plan is only as good as its execution. Knowing where and when to take that action is very important. As I said, you got to keep it going. There are strength in numbers. If you're not happy with your results, organize a community campaign and redo it. Just start over. I gave you 10 steps here. You can go back to any of them and revise as you go. When you realize this isn't working. Go into a legislator's office, you got all this stuff planned, you deliver your message, and it falls flat. And you go, duh. Come back and rewrite it. Start again. You learn from your lessons. Advocacy is much more than showing support. Effective advocacy uses tactics, but that's only part of the process. Advocacy is a comprehensive, ongoing process that grows and expands to help move forward an idea for a new law, a policy change, or other effort. So I say it's constantly growing. You may get the voter rights law passed, but you got to inform people that it's passed. Got Casey's law passed. But man, there's still so freaking much education to do. We still have judges that go, there's no such law. These are judges. So anyway, it's going to be ongoing forever. So that's it. That's my spiel. And I gave you 9 minutes. So I'm joking with Charlotte. I taught journalism for a number of years at the University of Kentucky, that other school down there. And I always know that I've learned through the years that it's better to let students go 9 minutes early than it is to keep them 30 seconds late.